So in this first video on conscience, we're going to look at different ideas, both religious and non-religious, about the nature of conscience. So in other words, what the conscience actually is. Now, in terms of the dictionary definition of conscience, it's defined as a person's moral sense of right and wrong, viewed as acting as a guide to one's behaviour. So, for example, we might use it in the sentence, he had a guilty conscience about his desires. But it's still not really clear from this definition where the conscience comes from, what it even is, whether it's a useful moral guide, or whether we should always obey it. And that's part of what we're going to be thinking about in this series of videos. So the different ideas, religious and non-religious, that we're going to cover, well, in the religious side, we're going to focus initially on the teachings of the Catholic Church about conscience and the views of Cardinal John Henry Newman, which informed those, and also the non-Catholic perspective of Joseph Butler. And then in the non-religious ideas about conscience, we're going to look at Sigmund Freud, Emil Durkheim and Erich Fromm. So remember, in the AQA course, it doesn't specify which ideas about the conscience you need to know. You just need to be able to, as it says there at the top in the spec point, you just have to know some different ideas that are both religious and non-religious. So you can really pick and choose from these ones or other ones that are in textbooks or revision guides. There's no set content that you need to know for this. So in terms of the religious views of the conscience, I think it's important to note that conscience actually played a really key role in one of the most famous speeches made in the Protestant Reformation. So when Martin Luther was being charged with heresy, he stated, "Here I stand, I can do no other," and "I cannot, nor will I, retract anything, since it is never safe nor virtuous to go against the conscience." Now, what this suggests is that Luther believed it was his God-given conscience that was guiding his action. And as we've said, there are many different views about the nature of conscience, both religious and non-religious, and we're going to start to look at those now. So firstly, we're going to look at the views of Cardinal John Henry Newman, who took the view in terms of the nature of conscience that it is the voice of God. So Cardinal John Henry Newman was a Roman Catholic theologian who believed the conscience to be the direct voice of God. He therefore considered the conscience to be divine in nature, since God is its source. And of course, this makes the conscience very valuable as a moral guide. Newman wrote, "If, as is the case, we feel responsibility, are ashamed, are frightened at transgressing the voice of conscience, this implies there is one to whom we are responsible, before whom we are ashamed, whose claims upon us we fear." Now, the Roman Catholic Church discussed conscience at the Second Vatican Council and decreed that its nature is the law that exists inside each person. This is believed to be written by God to speak to the individual heart. In the official Catholic document, Gaudium et Spes, the Church stated that conscience is man's most secret core and his sanctuary. There he is alone with God, whose voice echoes in the depths. The Church further made a connection between the conscience and divine law, stating in Dignitatis Humanae that it is through his conscience that man sees and recognises the demands of divine law. So church teachings then emphasise that the education of the conscience is a lifelong task to help elucidate the divine law, which should be started in childhood and continued through life. Now, while the views of Newman and the Catholic Church about the nature of the conscience differ slightly, they both imply that the conscience has divine origin and therefore would have significant value as a moral guide for Christians. Joseph Butler saw conscience as coming directly from God too. He was an Anglican priest, and he believed that human beings could be distinguished from animals because of the ability to reflect and be guided by conscience. In his own words, there is a principle of reflection in men by which they distinguish between approval and disapproval of their own actions. This principle in man is conscience. So what this shows is that for Butler, the nature of the conscience is that it is a principle of reflection. Butler also believed that conscience came directly from God. He argued that the conscience is a particularly powerful guide during moral decision making because, in his words, it magisterially exerts itself without being consulted. In other words, it will prompt you to feel certain things or to remember certain things without you asking it to. Butler preached that God placed conscience within us to be our proper governor, to regulate and direct all other principles. He wrote, "Had it strength as it has right, had it power as it has manifest authority, it would absolutely govern the world." Now, Butler saw human nature as a hierarchy with conscience at the top. At the bottom of the hierarchy, he saw basic drives, such as the drive for food. Just above this, he identified two general impulses, self-love and benevolence. Higher than this, Butler saw the principle of reflection, which leads us to either approve or disapprove of our actions. But Butler believed that this is given to us by God as a tool to help us to live happy lives. At the very top of this hierarchy of human nature, Butler believed that conscience, given by God, should have the final say in our moral decision making. Overall, Butler believed that conscience stems from God and is essentially a God-given guide to right conduct. He argued that since it is given by God, it must be followed. He stated, "It therefore belongs to our condition of being. It is our duty to walk in that path and follow this guide." It's clear to see that for Christians who agree with Butler's view, the conscience may have great value as a moral guide. Now, Butler adopted an intuitionist approach to the conscience. He didn't really discuss whether conscience is linked to reason or emotion. He just concluded that it exists, it comes directly from God, and it should be followed if the goal is to lead a happy and fulfilled life. However, interestingly, Butler did recognise that human beings have the capacity to corrupt their own conscience, which may lead us to question how valuable the conscience can really be as a moral guide. Let's move on now and look at 3 examples of non-religious views of the conscience, starting with the view of Sigmund Freud. So Freud developed probably the best known non-religious theory of conscience. His views on it were linked to his wider account of the mind and the distinction he identified between the id, the ego, and the superego. Freud suggested that there is a part of the human mind that internalises the reactions of other people and the rules and regulations given to us by those in authority, especially our parents, to develop a non-rational guilty conscience. And he referred to conscience as the superego. For Freud, this superego is the ethical component of the personality, so that's its nature. It provides the moral standards by which the rational self, or ego, operates in the world. So Freud explained that the superego develops in each person when they're aged between 3 to 5 years old in response to parental punishment and approval. This development occurs as a result of the child's internalization of his parents' moral standards, a process greatly aided by a tendency to identify with the parents. Freud explained that the developing superego absorbs the traditions of the family and the surrounding society, and serves to control aggressive or other socially unacceptable impulses. Any violation of the superego standards will result in feelings of guilt or anxiety and a feeling that one needs to atone for their actions. Freud believed that the superego helps control our instincts that relate to both eros, love and sexuality, and thanatos, violence and aggression. And he further explained that the positive aspirations and ideals of the superego represent the ideal self-image of each person. Freud famously said of the superego or conscience, "Nothing can be hidden from the superego, not even thoughts." Freud suggested that the superego or conscience functions at both the conscious and unconscious level. At the conscious level, Freud suggested that it reminds us when actions we may be tempted to take are wrong. And at the unconscious level, Freud suggested that it causes feelings of shame, guilt, and remorse after we act. So Freud's account of the conscience is an interesting one to consider since it is so different to the religious views we've outlined earlier. Whereas within Christianity, the conscience is believed to impart the wisdom of God and be a direct channel to that. For Freud, it is not an alternative and different source of moral authority at all, but just an echo from our childhood, reminding us of the ideas and beliefs that we were exposed to in our earliest years. Now, it can be argued that this potentially limits the value of the conscience as a moral guide, since following Freud's understanding, it's simply an echo of the voices of authority figures from our past, which may no longer be relevant or consistent with moral standards of morality for today. Now, Émile Durkheim was a French social psychologist and sociologist who came up with a really different view about the conscience. As a sociologist, Durkheim identified the conscience with social conditioning. His main idea about the nature of the conscience was that it is a collective conscience. He argued that a collective conscience exists which represents all the beliefs, moral attitudes, and values that are common in a society. Durkheim suggested that this collective conscience acts as a unifying force, as people collectively agree and disagree that certain actions are right or wrong. Durkheim identified the collective conscience as the totality of beliefs and sentiments common to average citizens of the same society. Durkheim explains that the collective conscience is influenced by and created through education, legislation, religion, art, culture, and science. Durkheim also stressed that the collective conscience is fluid and changes through time, and as a result it could potentially be distorted using manipulation and totalitarian propaganda, which would clearly impact negatively on its value as a moral guide. Durkheim also identified the conscience as a kind of survival mechanism and suggested that if people have shared values and this collective conscience, it actually has a positive impact on society. This view is further supported by evolutionary thinking, as the collective conscience can be viewed as a mechanism to develop loyalty to the group. Through this, a group can grow stronger and is more likely to survive, and this would support the value of the conscience as a moral guide. Thirdly, in our non-religious section on the conscience, we have Erich Fromm, who actually came up with two different perspectives on conscience, the authoritarian and also the humanistic conscience. So Fromm was a German psychoanalyst who escaped Nazi Germany for the US in 1933. His work on the conscience led to the development of his two related ideas of the authoritarian and humanistic conscience. He argued that we are victims of the authoritarian conscience and possessors of the humanistic conscience. From the perspective of his views on the nature of the conscience, it only has value as a moral guide to some extent. So let's start by looking at his view on the authoritarian conscience. So this was his original idea. Fromm worked out or considered that the conscience was authoritarian and was derived from a fear of displeasing authority. This led to guilt, causing even greater submission to authority. This fear was for Fromm so strong that it could lead people to blind, rigid thinking, not all of which would be correct. He actually saw this as the Nazis' method of manipulating conscience during their years in power. Fromm argued that the feelings we may associate with conscience, such as guilt, shame, and a sense of moral responsibility, stem from our fears that we will be rejected by our society. Fromm suggested that the rules that are put on us by external authorities, such as parents, schools, and religious groups, become part of ourselves and how we think and view the world and our place in it. Fromm suggested that in most social systems, the supreme virtue and ideal behaviour is obedience to authority. Instead of feeling responsible to specific external authorities, however, Fromm believed that we essentially feel responsible to something inside ourselves. Fromm argued that in most cases, when people experience a guilty conscience, it's because they feel as though they have disobeyed authority, rather than because they are actually really bothered about an actual issue. For Fromm, the conscience arises out of a fear of being excluded from society for disobedience, and he identified this perspective on the authoritarian conscience as essentially being the internalized voice of a disapproving society. Overall, Fromm's views about this authoritarian conscience suggest that it would have little value as a moral guide, beyond perhaps reminding us of prevailing social attitudes. Now, the humanistic conscience was Fromm's later idea, which came out of his move to America, where he escaped Nazism. In the 1950s, Fromm was influenced by humanistic psychology, which was emerging in the US. Humanistic psychology asserted that all human beings have free will and the capacity and drive for self-actualization. Fromm's humanitarian conscience is much closer to this position. It moves away from conscience as a fear of authority figures to see conscience as something a bit more positive. Fromm explained that we all have the ability to judge and evaluate our behaviour and ourselves as people, making us our own authority figures. So Fromm described the humanistic conscience as the aspect of the conscience that has intuitive knowledge of what will help human life to flourish and what will destroy it. He actually described the humanistic conscience as a reaction of ourselves to ourselves, and he viewed it as the voice of our true self. So that's its nature, the voice of our true self. Fromm believed that the humanistic conscience, the true self, calls us to act in a productive way and to develop to our fullest potential. So Fromm believes that the humanistic conscience has an intuitive knowledge of what is human and inhuman. For example, Fromm recognised that he had known the Nazi regime in Germany was inhuman, and so he fled to America. And he also had felt intuitively that the use of nuclear weapons was inhuman, and so had supported the total abolition of nuclear weapons in the years after the nuclear attacks on Japan. Now, Fromm's later work on the humanistic conscience suggests that it is a valuable moral guide. However, he did identify that the voice of our true self, the humanistic conscience, actually can't always be heard due to the influence of the authoritarian conscience, and this would potentially limit its overall value and usefulness. Fromm also highlighted that the less productively people live, the weaker their true self or humanistic conscience becomes. Fromm explained that it's tragic that the humanistic conscience is often at its weakest when we need it the most, and that at times of strife and trouble, the human response is often to listen to the voices of everybody else, and therefore the authoritarian conscience, and ignore what the humanistic conscience is truly guiding us to do. Overall, Fromm believes that if people are to reach their full potential, they should reject the authoritarian conscience and embrace the humanistic conscience instead.